Have you ever noticed how the very person who pushed you away sometimes ends up being the one who can't stop thinking about you later? It's one of the most fascinating patterns in human relationships. Today, we're diving into why the avoidant, the one who seemed so cold, so distant, so unwilling to commit, often ends up missing the very anxious partner they once rejected. This isn't just about love, it's about human psychology, unmet needs, and the way our deepest fears play out in connection. And if you understand this dynamic, not only will you see relationships differently, you'll understand yourself on a whole new level. That moment of relief is often temporary. It's a defense mechanism, not emotional clarity. See, avoidants are wired to create space when they feel emotionally overwhelmed. That's their survival instinct. When intimacy gets too close, their nervous system starts to ring internal alarm bells, and distancing becomes the only way they know how to self-soothe. So, they push away the very person who is offering them closeness, often the anxious partner who's desperately trying to bridge the gap. The anxious reaches out, seeks reassurance, clings. The avoidant retreats, gets irritated, shuts down. We've all seen this cycle play out. Maybe you've lived it. But the part that's so often misunderstood is what happens after the breakup. Because it's not just silence, something starts to shift. When the anxious partner finally goes no contact, when they stop reaching out, stop chasing, stop offering affection and attention. The avoidant isn't flooded with peace. Over time, they're flooded with something far more unsettling: space. And in that space, their emotions, those very ones they were trying to escape, begin to catch up with them. Regret starts to creep in, not always as a loud confession, but more often as a subtle growing discomfort. And that's when the avoidant begins to miss the anxious partner, the one they once dismissed, the one they felt smothered by. This is where it gets psychologically rich, because what's really going on here is that the avoidance defense mechanism, their emotional armor, starts to crack. When the anxious partner was still in the picture, always reaching out, always being available, the avoidant had control. They could count on the anxious person's presence, even if they pretended they didn't care. But once the anxious partner detaches for real, the avoidant is left with the very thing they thought they wanted: freedom. And it feels hollow. You see, most avoidants don't know how to process loss in real time. Their emotional processing is delayed. They intellectualize things to avoid feeling them, but emotions don't just disappear. They linger beneath the surface until the environment is safe enough or quiet enough for them to rise. That silence, that no-contact period, becomes the fertile ground for realization. And that realization is often laced with confusion because the avoidant doesn't understand why they're suddenly nostalgic, why they're scrolling through old texts, why they're replaying conversations, wondering if they made a mistake. But by then, the anxious partner may be healing, finding their footing, learning self-worth. And that shift, that loss of control over the anxious person's attention, creates a void. The very validation the avoidant once took for granted is gone. And they miss it, not just for the comfort it provided, but for what it meant that they mattered to someone, even when they tried to act like they didn't need anyone. This is the emotional boomerang of the avoidant mindset. They throw away the connection to protect themselves. But when the emotional dust settles, they realize that what they threw away wasn't a threat. It was someone who saw them, someone who stayed, someone who tried, and they miss that deeply. So, when you hear people say, "Why is my avoidant ex reaching out now?" Or, "Why do they seem to miss me after all this time?" It's not always about wanting to rekindle the relationship. Sometimes it's about trying to reattach to a part of themselves they lost in the process. Because losing someone who made you feel safe, even when you didn't know how to receive that safety, is a loss that takes time to understand. And here's the truth: people don't always miss you because they loved you well. Sometimes they miss you because you loved them well, and they didn't know how to hold it when it was in their hands. Let that land. Because if you're the anxious one listening to this right now and you're wondering why the person who pushed you away seems to suddenly care, remember it's not your responsibility to become their emotional clarity. That's their journey. Now, what we run from eventually becomes what we long for. And nothing haunts the avoidant more than the peace they couldn't appreciate when it was still knocking on their door. Let's talk about emotional investment, real deep, vulnerable emotional investment. Because when we're unpacking why avoidant individuals often end up missing the anxious ex they once rejected, this piece is critical. Anxiously attached individuals are not perfect, but one thing they bring into a relationship is emotional intensity. And not just intensity for the sake of drama. Intensity that comes from caring deeply, being Alan, and constantly monitoring the emotional temperature of the connection. They're the ones who notice the small changes, who remember the things you set off-handedly 3 weeks ago, who check in again and again just to make sure you're okay. That's not neediness, it's attunement. It's vigilance born from a fear of abandonment, yes, but it's also the very force that creates emotional safety when it's understood and reciprocated. Now, when someone with an avoidant attachment style enters into a relationship with someone anxious, there's often this initial spark. The avoidant is drawn to the warmth, the care, the availability. The anxious partner is emotionally present in a way that feels nourishing, almost like something the avoidant didn't even realize they were craving. But because avoidants are conditioned to equate closeness with risk, they begin to pull back the moment things feel too good. It's not because the love isn't real, it's because it is real, and real connection triggers old wounds. So what does the anxious partner do when the avoidant starts to pull away? They double down, they try harder. They give more, they reach out, they apologize, they try to fix something they didn't even break. Because for the anxious partner, rejection feels like a threat to their core self-worth. And repair becomes an act of survival. And here's the twist. The avoidant in that moment often feels smothered, not because they're being harmed, but because they never learned how to receive consistent care without feeling engulfed. So, they reject the very thing they once craved. But here's what happens after the relationship ends, especially if the anxious partner goes silent. Over time, the avoidant begins to remember what they lost. Not just the person, but the experience of being cared for in such a relentless and devoted way. They begin to recall the small, everyday ways the anxious partner showed up. The morning texts, the thoughtful check-ins, the emotional labor that was done quietly without being asked, and they start to miss it. Not because they suddenly evolved into a secure person overnight, but because that kind of emotional investment is rare. You don't forget someone who loved you that thoroughly, even if you didn't know how to receive it at the time. There's a kind of emotional richness that anxious partners bring into relationships that can only be appreciated in hindsight by someone who's been guarded their whole life. Avoidants often grew up in environments where emotions weren't mirrored or validated. So, when someone finally shows up with consistent, heartfelt presence, it can feel overwhelming or even suspicious. But once that presence is gone, the void is unmistakable. The avoidant might not have had the tools to nurture the relationship, but they will absolutely notice when the emotional supply dries up, and they'll miss it because emotional investment like that is not transactional, it's transformative. This is where things get philosophical. When you receive love that is offered freely, not for control, but out of genuine care, you're being invited into a kind of intimacy that exposes your deepest defenses. The anxious partner in their pursuit of closeness often mirrors to the avoidant everything they've been unconsciously running from. Vulnerability, accountability, emotional transparency, and while that mirror can be terrifying, it's also healing if you're ready to face it. Most avoidants aren't ready, so they reject it. But rejection doesn't erase memory. It doesn't erase the body's experience of being seen, held, and understood. And that's what they miss. Not just the person, but the emotional world that person created around them. A world where they were allowed to be human. A world where someone stayed even when they pulled away. A world where love was persistent, not conditional. That's what the anxious partner gives. Whether it's sustainable or not, whether it's balanced or not, it's real. And once it's gone, it's not easy to replicate. So, if you're the anxious one who feels like your love was wasted, let me be clear, it wasn't. You showed someone a version of connection they may not have been ready to hold, but that doesn't make it any less valuable, and it sure as hell doesn't make you any less worthy. Because emotional investment doesn't become less meaningful just because someone couldn't receive it. It becomes part of their story, whether they ever admit it or not. And sometimes the thing they miss most isn't you, it's how they felt in your presence. Let that sit with you, let it empower you, and let it remind you that giving your heart is never foolish, even if the other person didn't know what to do with it. We live in a culture that glorifies independence. Being self-made, emotionally untouchable, unbothered, and avoidant individuals often internalize that narrative so deeply that they confuse emotional self-be protection with personal strength. But here's the truth. What looks like independence is often just fear dressed up in control. The avoidant person doesn't just prefer space. They need it to regulate their internal discomfort with closeness because closeness feels risky. Intimacy feels like a loss of self. So what do? They create distance, they build walls, they chase freedom, and it works for a while. In a relationship, especially with an anxiously attached partner, the avoidant gets used to operating with this emotional buffer. The anxious person often compensates for that emotional gap, reaching out more, showing up harder, constantly tuning in. That dynamic allows the avoidant to maintain the illusion that they're in control. They get to feel emotionally insulated yet still attached, still desired, still tethered, but on their terms. But here's where it gets fascinating. The moment that anxious partner actually lets go, whether it's through heartbreak, self-respect, or exhaustion, the avoidant suddenly finds themselves in uncharted territory because now they're alone for real. Not just alone in theory, but in practice. The texts stop. The emotional check-ins vanish. The emotional energy they once quietly relied on disappears. And that's when the illusion of independence starts to crack. You see, avoidants aren't immune to connection. They're simply afraid of needing it. But we are wired biologically, neurologically for attachment. It doesn't matter how much someone prides themselves on being low, manageable emotionally. When a meaningful connection is severed, especially one that provided consistent attention, the nervous system registers that loss. And it's not always dramatic. Sometimes it's just this slow creeping sense of emptiness, of disorientation, of realizing, wait, I kind of miss that person, but I don't understand why. This is where psychological defenses begin to fail. The belief that I'm better off alone starts to feel shaky. When the absence of the other person isn't freeing, it's unsettling because it's in that silence that the avoidant is forced to confront something deeper. They weren't just running from the other person, they were running from their own vulnerability. And once that anxious ex stops showing up to keep the connection afloat, the avoidant loses more than a partner. They lose the emotional scaffolding that was propping up their entire facade of detachment. What often follows is an emotional reckoning. The avoidant begins to replay old memories, not out of longing at first, but out of confusion. Something feels off. Something feels missing, and they start to question whether the distance they once fought so hard to create was actually a form of protection or self-sabotage. This isn't a conscious shift. Most of the time it happens gradually, but it's real. This is where we see the paradox. The freedom they fought for now feels like abandonment, but not because the other person walked away. They pushed them away, and now they're sitting in the very space they demanded, realizing it's not peace they've found. It's isolation, and let's be honest, true independence isn't about being untouched by other people. It's about having the strength to be in connection without losing yourself. That's real emotional maturity. And it's something avoidants often struggle to develop until they lose someone who gave them that chance and didn't ask them to become someone else in return. So, when an avoidant starts to miss the anxious partner, it's not just nostalgia, it's the slow unraveling of a false narrative. The story they told themselves that they didn't need anyone, that closeness was dangerous, that emotional distance equals control begins to fall apart because now they see what they lost. Not a person who caged them, but someone who cared, someone who kept trying to connect despite the wall, someone who saw them beneath the emotional armor. And if you're the one who walked away, if you're the anxious partner who finally stopped chasing, please hear this. You didn't fail that relationship. You outgrew a dynamic that asked you to keep proving your worth to someone too afraid to receive it. When they miss you, and they will, it won't be because you begged for their love. It'll be because for the first time, there's nothing left to run from but themselves. That's the moment the illusion of freedom shatters, and what's left is the truth that real connection was never the threat. It was the invitation. There's something most people miss when they talk about avoidant attachment. It's not just that avoidants don't like to be close, it's that they've never been taught how to use closeness as a safe space. See, for a lot of avoidant individuals, relationships are a threat, not because the other person is harmful, but because vulnerability feels dangerous. It's unfamiliar, and unfamiliar to the avoidant feels unsafe. So what happens when they meet someone with an anxious attachment style? Someone who is emotionally available, who listens intently, who checks in regularly, who says, "I care about you even when you pull away." In the beginning, it's intoxicating. There's a safety in being accepted so fully, even when they're distant, even when they're moody or emotionally unavailable. The anxious partner becomes a kind of emotional cushion, a place where the avoidant can unload without having to fully unpack. And they come to rely on that dynamic, even if they never admit it. This is the hidden truth. Avoidance often feels safest with people who will hold space for them emotionally without demanding that they open up in return. The anxious partner becomes the emotional outlet, the soft place to land. It's like having a quiet emergency exit for your feelings. You may never use it fully, but you're comforted by the fact that it's there. But here's where things get complicated. Getting present because that emotional safety net, that unconditional presence from the anxious partner starts to feel too close, too exposed. So, the avoidant starts to retreat. Not because the anxious person has done something wrong, but because the emotional intimacy starts to feel overwhelming, the very thing they feel comforted by. Emotional availability becomes the thing they resist, and then comes the push-pull. The avoidant pulls away, the anxious reaches out, the avoidant shuts down. The anxious tries harder, the avoidant needs space, the anxious needs reassurance. This loop continues until eventually the anxious partner breaks. They stop reaching out, they pull their energy back, they learn, often through pain, that they can't keep giving to someone who won't meet them halfway. Now the avoidant finds themselves alone, the emotional outlet is gone, and for the first time they feel the silence not as peace, but as loss. They feel the absence not as freedom, but as disconnection, and it hits them in a way they didn't expect, because even if they weren't emotionally expressive, they were still emotionally held. They had someone who saw them even in the mess, someone who accepted their emotional inconsistency, someone who, despite all the walls, still tried to understand what was going on underneath. And when that person is gone, there's a deep sense of emptiness that starts to rise. It doesn't show up as immediate heartbreak. It shows up as a growing sense that something essential is missing. This is what avoidants miss when the anxious ex leaves. They miss the emotional container that held their unspoken fears. They miss the person who didn't demand vulnerability, but created space for it anyway. They miss the safety of knowing that someone cared enough to stay even when they didn't know how to show they needed them. And let's be clear, this isn't about emotional dependence. It's about the human need to be seen, heard, understood. All of us, whether we're anxious, avoidant, secure, or somewhere in between, are wired to connect. And when you've had a relationship where someone held space for your most guarded self, losing that connection creates an emotional echo, even if you pushed it away. Now, here's where the philosophy kicks in. Vulnerability at its core is an act of trust, and trust is built not just by who we open up to, but by how they respond when we do. Avoidants may not verbalize their needs, but they feel deeply when someone shows up for them without judgment. When someone allows their silence to speak, when someone stays even when they don't know what to say, and when that presence is gone, the avoidant has to confront a truth they've spent most of their emotional lives avoiding, that emotional safety isn't something you find by retreating. It's something you build by allowing yourself to be known. And they didn't know how to do that, not yet. So if you're the one who offered that emotional space, if you were the quiet landing place for someone who couldn't meet you there, it's okay to grieve the connection, but never doubt the value of what you gave. You modeled safety, you modeled emotional depth, and you taught someone maybe for the first time what it feels like to be held. Sometimes people don't miss you because you said the right things. They miss you because you made them feel like they didn't have to say anything at all.